So what are we going to do now to fix the problem? What's the viable solution that Trump has? What is this thinking outside of the box add up to? There's no question he's thinking outside of the box, but is what he is thinking logical? Is it viable? Is it morally correct? I don't think it's any of those things. I, as an American, certainly don't want to be associated with a policy that calls for ethnically cleansing Gaza at the end of a rifle barrel. And furthermore, I don't think you can do it. The Israelis were unable to do it. I don't think we're going to be able to do it. Trump has made it clear we're not going to go in there and do it. So who's going to do it? The Israelis? Well, they've already tried. What do you think they've been doing for the past 15 months? This is like, people say if the hostages don't come back on Saturday, these are the Israeli hostages who are due to be released this Saturday. If they don't come back, Netanyahu is going to restart the war. And I say to myself, okay, what does that mean? The war was not going very well, which is why the Israelis agreed to the ceasefire. They didn't agree to the ceasefire because Trump put great pressure on them. They agreed to the ceasefire in large part because the IDF, the Israeli military, put great pressure on Netanyahu to effect a ceasefire because the IDF understood it could not defeat Hamas, number one, and number two, the Israeli army was coming apart at the seams. It was suffering great casualties in Gaza, and furthermore, that this is an army that's configured for fighting short wars, not long wars. It was not configured to fight a war of attrition over a long period of time in Gaza. So it was in deep trouble. So the Israelis agreed to a ceasefire. There was no way you were going to solve this one because the Israelis from the beginning have wanted all of Greater Israel. They were never interested in giving the Palestinians a state of their own. This is a myth that we purvey in the West so that we can support Israel fully. So it's not like I think there is a solution out there, a viable solution. The best that the Israelis were able to come up with was where they basically locked the Palestinians in Gaza in a giant open air prison, and they thought they could manage that problem. And that looked like it worked up until October 7th. And now the question is, what do you do moving forward? And the Israelis would like to cleanse Gaza. That's been their policy goal since October 7th, to cleanse Gaza. They want to get rid of all the Palestinians. And now we're talking about putting an end to that ceasefire. Okay, what's the magic formula that the Israelis have now come up with that's going to allow them to deal with the Hamas problem that they couldn't deal with for the first 16 months of the war? I just don't understand. So, Trump is thinking outside the box, but sometimes thinking outside the box makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, I don't think it makes sense. But the idea that the Israelis were interested in a meaningful two-state solution, and it was the Palestinians who rejected those wholly generous offers by the Israelis, is a tall tale. And I know we tell it in the West, and when I make the argument that I'm making, people think that, I'm an anti-Semite or I'm hostile to Israel and so forth and so on. But there's a whole literature written by Israelis that makes it clear that the Israelis were never interested in creating a Palestinian state, and they wanted all of Israel. They just understood that they'd have to do it gradually. They wouldn't be able to take all that territory all at once. I think it's quite clear that every Arab country, indeed every Arab and Islamic country, is adamantly opposed to an ethnic cleansing policy that results in the Palestinians being displaced to Jordan and Egypt. And King Abdullah, the head of Jordan, made it clear yesterday that he was not going to go along with this scheme of President Trump's. And the Egyptians have also made it clear. And in fact, General al-Sisi, who was supposed to come to Washington to talk to Trump, canceled his trip. So they're not going to willingly accept that. Now, it is theoretically possible that the Americans and the Israelis, operating as a tag team, will ethnically cleanse the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza at the end of a rifle barrel. It's theoretically possible. I do not think it's practically possible. I find it hard to believe that the United States would actively participate in such a morally reprehensible policy. I think the Israelis would do it. But even there, I think a lot of pressure would be brought to bear on the Israelis not to ethnically cleanse Gaza at the end of a rifle barrel. I think there's some possibility that Hamas and the Israeli government will settle their differences before Saturday. I'm not saying that is going to happen. I think there's some possibility. I say that because it's very clear that Hamas wants to make the ceasefire work. No question there. And although there's a lot of evidence that Netanyahu doesn't, the fact is that he has powerful incentives to make this work, at least for the time being, so that he gets more hostages out. My guess is that at the start of the ceasefire, there were 98 hostages being held by Hamas, and a good number of them, 30 plus, I think, were dead. But anyway, of the 98, as best I can tell, 16 have been taken out. Okay. 16 have been taken out. That's 16 out of 98. That tells you there are a lot of hostages there. And Netanyahu has a deep-seated interest in getting most, if not all, of those hostages back. So if the fighting starts up again on Saturday, a lot of hostages will remain stuck in Gaza, and that's not in Netanyahu's interest. Furthermore, what exactly are the Israelis going to do if the ceasefire breaks down? They spent about 16 months pounding the living daylights out of the Gaza Strip. There's not much left to destroy. They didn't destroy Hamas. Hamas is alive and well. So what are they going to do after Saturday when they restart the war that they couldn't do in those 16 months? Do they now have a war-winning strategy? I think the answer is no. So I don't understand, what they gain by restarting the war. And again, the whole hostage problem is staring Netanyahu in the face. So I think an argument could be made that you'll get a deal, some sort of deal before Saturday. I may be wrong, who knows for sure, but if you don't get a deal, apparently the Israelis are going to go back to pounding Gaza. Where that leads, I don't know. It's not going to lead to any kind of victory by the Israelis. So they'll just end up in the same place they were in on January 19th when the ceasefire started. So my sense is that for the foreseeable future, the Palestinians will remain in Gaza and in the West Bank. But at the same time, there's no question the Israelis will constantly be looking for opportunities to cleanse those two parts of Greater Israel so that they can move away from the present situation, which is one where Israel is an apartheid state, to one where there are hardly any Palestinians in their midst, and therefore they obviate the apartheid problem. Look, the fact is the United States is remarkably powerful, and it has tremendous leverage over Egypt and Jordan, because in the past, we worked out a deal with Egypt and Jordan where we would give them huge amounts of financial aid if they played nice with Israel. We bought off for Israel. We did this for Israel. We bought off Jordan and Egypt. Again, there's a huge literature on this. This is not something I'm making up. But once we do that, not only do we guarantee at the time that Egypt and Jordan will play nice with Israel, but it gives us huge leverage over time. And Trump fully understands that. And he's basically telling the Jordanians and the Egyptians, we have huge economic leverage over you. And we're going to use that leverage to force you. We're going to coerce you into accepting the Palestinians. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not the Jordanians and the Egyptians will cave. And the Jordanians made it clear yesterday. The Jordanian president made it clear in a tweet after his meeting with Trump that that's not going to happen. And Sisi, General Sisi, the Egyptian leader canceled his trip to Washington because he doesn't want to be humiliated by Trump. And he wants to make it clear that he's not going to go along either. So you have a situation here, Freddie. The Palestinians are not going to leave. The Egyptians are not going to take them. The Jordanians are not going to take them. And then you have to ask yourself a simple question. Where does that leave us? It's actually united the Arab states in the region. There's universal agreement among the Arab states and universal agreement in the Arab and Islamic world that this is morally reprehensible, that this is the Palestinians' land, that the United States and Israel have absolutely no right to push them out. And in no way are they going to accommodate the United States and Israel. We're isolated on this one. I'm sure the Europeans are with us on this for the most part. But outside of the Europeans, there's no support for what the United States wants to do in this case. The last thing Jordan wants is to create a huge enclave for more Palestinians inside its borders. And Egypt is thinking the same way. And with regard to Saudi Arabia, if you read what the Saudis are now saying about Trump's plan to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, it's quite clear that we're further than ever from having an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia. Now, in the West, people like to talk about the fact that an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia is just around the corner. I would argue that if you look carefully at the evidence, that's not true at all. But even if you get an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia, what's the big deal? Is that going to help with all these different problems in places like Gaza, the West Bank, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran? I think the answer is no. We don't talk about the Saudi versus Israel conflict, right? Or the Sudan versus Israel conflict. We talk about places like Gaza, the West Bank, the Palestinians, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria. And these accords have little to do with those conflicts. The United States and Israel destroyed Gaza. The Israelis were executing a genocide. I mean, Trump sits there with Netanyahu and they talk about Gaza now being unlivable, and they talk about all the destruction in Gaza and the fact that the Palestinians cannot live there. It has been so thoroughly wrecked. And then the question is, who wrecked Gaza? Who did this? And the answer is the Israelis. Benjamin Netanyahu sitting right next to Trump, and Netanyahu did it in cahoots with Joe Biden and the West, and especially the United States. We should pay for rebuilding Gaza. The Israelis should pay for rebuilding Gaza. It's the Israelis and the Americans who destroyed Gaza, not the Egyptians or the Jordanians. My response to that is Trump's proposal on Gaza is not a serious proposal. The United States is not going to ethnically cleanse Gaza and then turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. This is about as likely as Canada becoming the 51st state. Trump likes to bluster. He likes to make all of these outrageous statements, and then everybody pays huge amounts of attention to these statements, and they never add up to much. You remember when he fell in love with the North Koreans, and he was going to solve that problem, get rid of North Korean nuclear weapons. How well did that work out? The answer is not very well at all. And this one's not going to work out very well either. This is a giant problem. Trump is somebody who says one thing 1 minute and then says the exact opposite a minute later. So it's hard to tell exactly what's going on. I mean, as I said at the top of the show, I do think that Trump is into sowing chaos, and he operates on the assumption that if you sow chaos, that this will help him, to develop a solution to the various problems, or develop solutions to the various problems that the United States faces around the world. And maybe that's what's going on here. Maybe he's just bent on, saying different things on different days. I would note, though, Freddie, just very quickly, that to contradict myself, at first it looked like when he was talking about turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, that he was just posturing and this was not serious. But it now looks like he really believes that he thinks that this is a meaningful policy position to hold, and that he, for the time being, is going to stick to it. I don't know how long he'll stick to it, because it ought to be quite apparent to him that he's not getting a lot of support in the Arab world, and that Hamas is not going to give up easily in Gaza, and he's going to have to force them out, the Palestinians, if he wants to put this grand plan of his into operation. And by the way, Trump played an important role in fashioning the ceasefire that took place on January 19th. This is the Gaza ceasefire that took place on January 19th, which, of course, is the day before he moved into the White House. He sent his mediator, his Middle East mediator, Steve Witkoff, to the Middle East to basically tell Netanyahu, let's get a ceasefire. So it looked like Trump was off to a good start, right? We got a ceasefire in Gaza. And most people, not Netanyahu and company, but most people thought that was all for the good. But since he moved into the White House on January 20th, he's cut in the other direction. And if anything, he's done all he can to undermine the ceasefire agreement. And in my opinion, that doesn't make sense from his point of view, because a ceasefire and trying to work out some sort of meaningful modus vivendi with Israel and the Palestinians is a much smarter thing to do than try to turn Gaza into the Riviera in the Middle East. Netanyahu is not interested in maximum pressure. We've tried maximum pressure before. You want to remember that President Trump, in his first term, walked away from the nuclear arms agreement that the West and the Russians and the Chinese had fashioned with Iran. This is the famous JCPOA. That was the nuclear agreement. In 2018, Trump walked away from that, and Trump said that we're going to instead pursue a policy of maximum pressure to force Iran to agree to a better deal. Well, that failed. And what he's doing now is he is telling the Israelis, he's telling Netanyahu something he doesn't want to hear, which is that the United States is not planning on using military force to attack Iran. That's what Netanyahu wants. He wants the United States and Israel operating as a tag team to go in and blast the nuclear facilities in Iran. Trump has made it clear he has no interest in doing that, and instead he's going back to maximum pressure. The Israelis, of course, had to agree in public with Trump's policy position, but behind closed doors, they're adamantly opposed to it, which is why Haaretz had this headline yesterday saying that Netanyahu's position on Iran was undermined during his visit to Washington. First of all, with regard to Iran, Iran is now enriching uranium up to 60% as a result of walking away from the JCPOA, as a result of Trump's policy, which was enthusiastically backed by Benjamin Netanyahu. We're now in a situation where Iran is about 2 weeks away from where it could enrich enough uranium for 4 or 5 bombs. 2 weeks away. To go from 60% enrichment to 90% enrichment is easy. That is saying that we are in much worse shape today with regard to a nuclear Iran than we were in 2018 when Trump walked away from the JCPOA. With regard to the Abraham Accords, I don't think the Abraham Accords matter for very much anyway. So there are these 4 Abraham Accords. What do they have to do with solving the Palestinian problem? What do they have to do with solving the Hezbollah problem? What do they have to do with solving the Syrian problem? What do they have to do with solving the Iranian problem? The answer is virtually nothing. So you have good relations between the UAE and Israel. You have good relations between Sudan and Morocco and Israel. Does this really matter? Were those countries at war and all of a sudden those wars were shut down by the Abraham Accords? I think not. I mean, the Israel lobby is deeply committed to making sure that the United States and Iran remain mortal enemies, at least as long as Iran has the capability to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium. And therefore, I think if Trump began to play nice with Iran, the Israel lobby would move in and make it very clear to him that that's unacceptable, and he would change his behavior. It's very important to understand that the United States has a relationship with Israel that has no parallel in recorded history. The United States and Israel, despite the fact they sometimes have different interests, this is not to deny that they sometimes have the same interest, but they often have different interests. And in those cases, the lobby works overtime to make sure that the United States supports Israel unconditionally. And that's what the special relationship is all about. And the lobby is, I believe, the most powerful lobby or interest group in the history of the United States. And it wields enormous influence. And if any president pursues a policy in the Middle East that the Israelis adamantly oppose, you can rest assured that the lobby will go to work on Israel's behalf and push that American leader to support Israel. So on the Iran issue, you know, Bill Clinton, when he was president, he started to play nice with the Israelis. And the lobby quickly moved in and told him the basic facts of life, which is he's not allowed to play nice with the Iranians because the Israeli government considers that unacceptable. I laid this out, Steve Walton, I laid this out in our chapter on Iran in the book on the Israel lobby.
Mm.
I think there's no question if it was clear that Iran assassinated President Trump, and let's hope that never happens. Let's hope he's never assassinated, period. But if there was clear evidence that Iran assassinated Trump as president, there's no question whether Trump left orders or not that his successor would make Iran pay a god-awful price. There's just no question about that. But there's no evidence that Iran is trying to assassinate Trump that I know of. If there's evidence, they can show it to me, and then I'll believe it. But I don't think that Iran would be crazy enough to assassinate Trump. They surely can figure out what the consequences would be for them, and they would not be good. And therefore, I don't think they're out to assassinate Trump. So I think this is much to do about nothing. Trump told us that he was going to settle the Ukrainian conflict in one day. And there is no evidence that we are even close to settling the Ukraine conflict. And if anything, we're heading in the other direction. So he has failed so far. Now, of course, he's only been in office for 3 weeks, but there is no evidence that he has a plan for shutting this war down. And it looks like the war is going to go on. And it looks like he is doing everything he can to dump this war into the lap of the Europeans. And it looks like the Europeans are coming to recognize that they don't have any choice but to accept much more of the burden of dealing with this war. So this is bad news all around. Bad news for the Ukrainian people, bad news for the Russians, bad news for the United States, bad news for the West, because we're not going to shut this one down anytime soon. And basically what Trump is saying is that if you don't pay us back for what he claims is the $300 billion that we've given you to fight this war, if you don't pay us back with this mineral wealth, we're going to cut off our assistance to you. This is what you call transactional. This is completely at odds with basic realist logic. I mean, it looks like we're in this to make money. And it's no accident that the German chancellor condemned Trump for making this claim or making this line of argument. It makes us look like we're mercenaries. Just a fundamental mistake, and it's completely at odds with realism. I'm not exactly sure what Trump is up to. It, it doesn't make sense to me to say, after all of the attention the United States has paid to the Ukraine war, after all the support that the United States has given to Ukraine, to all of a sudden turn around and say, if you don't give us a huge chunk of your mineral wealth, we're going to abandon you. But if you don't, right? If you do give us all of this mineral wealth, we won't abandon you. We'll continue to support the war. That's what he's saying. That's certainly not a realist perspective. Certainly not a morally correct perspective. And it raises the question: what is he doing here? Why do this? And I don't have a good answer. And from a Russian point of view, this is hardly the end of the world, because the Russians are doing very well on the battlefield. And what they will do is continue to move westward, and they will hope that at some time in the not too distant future, the Ukrainian forces in front of them collapse and they can capture even more territory. I think the big issue here is not whether the Russians annex these 4 oblasts that they now basically control and Crimea. I think the interesting question is whether they end up annexing other oblasts, places like Odessa and Kharkiv as well. I would like to see, for the Ukrainians' sake, that not happen. But the more this war goes on, the more likely it is that the Ukrainians will lose more territory than they've already lost. And most people who talk about deploying NATO troops in Ukraine talk about it in the context of a ceasefire. And if any NATO troops are put in Ukraine during a ceasefire, I think that what will happen is those troops will eventually be attacked when the ceasefire breaks down. And in fact, I would argue the Russians will not even allow those NATO troops to come in to Ukraine in the context of the ceasefire. It's just going to be unacceptable to them. And if we insist and those NATO troops come in, even if they're just European troops, it seems to me the ceasefire will either not happen or break down, and the Russians will go after those troops, as they should. With regard to a genuine peace agreement and security guarantees, I do not believe the Russians are going to allow NATO or the Europeans to station troops in Ukraine. I'm not even sure they're going to allow them to give a security guarantee. Or if they do allow the Europeans to give a security guarantee, there'll be all sorts of caveats attached to that. From a Russian point of view, Ukraine has to be a genuinely neutral country, period. You want to remember that from the Russian point of view, what this war is all about is Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. And a lot of these proposals about stationing European or NATO troops in Ukraine and security guarantees and so forth and so on is, in effect, a de facto way of bringing Ukraine into NATO. And that's not going to happen. Well, you could argue that a security guarantee does not mean that European or NATO troops actually engage in the fighting, that they, in effect, do in a future conflict what they have done in this war that has run since 2022. And that is that they provide all sorts of material and economic support for Ukraine, but NATO troops or European troops don't fight inside of Ukraine for Ukraine. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that those European or NATO troops actually fight on behalf of Ukraine. I think it's extremely unlikely that the Europeans would make that commitment. We're not going to make that commitment. And I think that, in effect, what's going on here is you're not going to get a meaningful security guarantee from the West to come to Ukraine's rescue if the war breaks out again. And what that means is you're going to end up with a genuinely neutral Ukraine. I think basically a sunk costs argument. I mean, so many people in the West have devoted so many years and so much effort to making the argument that it is imperative that we support Ukraine now and forever, that they simply find it impossible to back off from that way of thinking about the Ukraine situation. And of course, it's tragic, especially for the Ukrainians, because this is not in their interest. But the fact is that if you look at the foreign policy elite in the United States and in most countries in Western Europe, they are filled with people who are profoundly committed to Ukraine. If you don't agree to Russia's terms, and you recognize the fact that you're going to lose, that the Russians are going to prevail in Ukraine, what's the soft landing? And I think if I had been playing his hand, even before I came into office, but certainly after I came into office, I would have told the whole world I was inheriting a situation where it was clearly the case that we could not win the war in Ukraine and that we were going to lose. And it's not my fault. It's Joe Biden's fault. I inherited this problem. That's what he should have been saying. But he didn't say that. And it's now his problem. He has to handle it. And he has no way of solving this problem of putting an end to the crisis and creating a genuine peace agreement between Ukraine and the West on one side and the Russians on the other. So what's going to happen here, as we said before, is the war is going to go on. The Russians, I believe, are going to win an ugly victory, and it's going to be a smashing defeat for both NATO and for President Trump. Well, I think it's implicit in what Zelensky has been saying, and even what Trump has been saying, that we will continue to support Ukraine if they give us $500 billion worth of these critical minerals. That, I think, is what's going on here. The problem that Trump faces is the problem that Biden faced in Afghanistan. In other words, Trump was the person who decided we were going to pull out of Afghanistan, but he had the good fortune to leave office before we did it. And it was under Biden's watch that we left Afghanistan. And Biden suffered a huge political defeat for pulling out of Afghanistan, and for the American public seeing that as a big loss. And Trump's problem here is that if we lose in Ukraine, which is eventually going to happen, it's going to be on his watch. And he's going to have egg all over his face. This is a real problem for him. He has to think about how he wants to put an end to this. It's hard to know what Western leaders are thinking on this issue. I mean, I believe there's a more important issue than Zelensky. The question is the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, willing to accept Putin's key demands and cut a deal? You have to start there. And if the answer is yes, that we're willing to cut the deal, we're willing to recognize the Russian annexation of these 4 oblasts plus Crimea, we're willing to accept the fact that Ukraine will be a neutral country, then we can worry about Ukraine. But there's no point in worrying about Ukraine when we can't even agree on the basic Russian demands. So there's just no deal on the table, independent of Ukraine. So I think that worrying about Zelensky doesn't matter very much. Well, I think that the Russians are now dug in, that they won't negotiate with Zelensky. And I think that there will probably be elections in Ukraine, and Zelensky will lose or not run, and you'll get a new Ukrainian leader. The question is, who is that new Ukrainian leader going to be? Is it going to be some reasonable individual who the Putin forces in the Kremlin feel they can deal with? Or is it going to be somebody who they identify as a Nazi or a fascist, or someone who looks a lot like Zelensky? And if that happens, what are the Russians going to do? So I don't think, we can tell for sure what the end result of an election will be. And in the final analysis, I don't think it matters that much. I think what really matters to the Russians are their first three demands as you described them. I don't think you're going to get an agreement. And I think it's because the West and Ukraine will not agree to Russia's main demands. And absent agreement on those main demands, you're not going to negotiate an end to the conflict. And that means that the conflict will go on. The idea that Russia and the United States, and in fact, almost every European country, would allow Ukraine to have nuclear weapons at this point in time is, in my opinion, unthinkable. The Russians will not let it happen. We will not let it happen. It is not in our interest for Ukraine to have nuclear weapons because Ukraine will probably use those weapons and drag us into a nuclear war. And that we don't want. So this is just not going to happen. And, he can demand that we give him more missiles and other forms of conventional weaponry. But as has been clear for at least a year now, there's nothing in the cupboard. It's not like we can just open the door of the cupboard, pull out all these weapons, start shipping them to Ukraine, and that will solve all their problems. And furthermore, as we all know at this point in time, the main problem is not weaponry, it's manpower. And they don't have the manpower. And the Russians do have the manpower. And all of this is to say that Ukraine is in deep, deep trouble. And Zelensky recognizes that. And he's flailing around making wild statements about nuclear weapons because he really has nothing else he can do. The Russians have made it very clear what they want. And the question is, what is Trump willing to do to accommodate the Russians? What's the plan? There's no evidence they have a plan. There's no evidence there are any meaningful contacts between the Russians and the Americans for purposes of shutting this war down. So I don't think that releasing some prisoner makes any difference at all. The question is, what is the deal? What does Trump think he can do to shut this war down? And there's no evidence that the administration has the foggiest idea how they can shut this war down. And instead, Trump has been saying outrageous things about the Russians that are, if anything, designed to erode trust between the Russians and the Americans. And there's not very much trust to begin with. But, he says that the Russians have suffered 1 million deaths, which is a ludicrous claim, that their economy is in shambles, which is another ludicrous claim. And he says that he's going to do Putin a favor by shutting this war down for him, that we're going to do Putin a favor. Do you think this is going to make Putin think that Trump is somebody he can trust? Of course not. And Putin doesn't trust the West much at all. And Trump is just making the problem worse. So there's no concrete proposal floating around. There are no viable ideas coming out of the administration on how to accommodate the Russians, who happen to be in the driver's seat on the battlefield. And instead, what you're getting are rather outlandish statements that, if anything, going to make it harder to get a deal rather than easier. But what we're talking about now is how he is acting since he moved into the White House on January 20th. What exactly is his grand strategy? And I think that at this point in time, it looks like it's hard to say exactly how he's going to pursue those broad realist goals. And I think, if anything, it looks remarkably chaotic. If you made me president of the United States, we don't have to worry about that ever happening, I would not have come into office and started talking about, annexing Canada, taking back the Panama Canal, and so forth and so on. I would have put all my attention on trying to shut down the Gaza conflict once and for all, and also trying to shut down the Ukraine conflict once and for all. Those should be the highest priority issues. And I don't think that he has paid much attention to Ukraine. And with regard to Gaza, I think that his proposal to ethnically cleanse Gaza and turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East is really crazy and is not going to help the situation. You want to remember that when he became president in 2017, he immediately abandoned engagement with China and switched to a containment policy. And indeed, he campaigned on abandoning engagement and moving toward containment in 2016. And I believe that's a very realist policy. He's also made the argument that all these terrible forever wars should have never happened, and that he was going to end them, and that he was not going to engage in any more forever wars. Given those policy positions, I applaud him. I think he was on the money. He's talked about pushing the Palestinians, all of the Palestinians. By my count, there were before this conflict started on October 7th, there were about 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. And he's talking about clearing them all out. And that would have to be done at the end of a rifle barrel. Those people are not going to leave. He has not said that he was going to push them out at the end of a rifle barrel, but that is implicit in what he says. But he's committed to getting rid of those people, and he's now said that they're not welcome back. In the beginning, when he first raised this idea, he talked about pushing them out maybe temporarily. But now that's been taken off the table, and the idea is that they're going to be pushed out permanently, and he's going to find new homes for them in places like Jordan and Egypt. So he may have realist instincts. This is your point. And he may be a marked improvement on his predecessor and his predecessors in this regard. I'm not going to argue against that. But in terms of how he's actually performed in the first 3 weeks, and we do want to be aware of the fact that he's only been president for 3 weeks. And that's a very short period of time. So you don't want to pass final judgment. But I would just say, I don't think he's off to a good start. In other words, no, I don't think anybody believes Canada is going to become the 51st state or that we're going to invade Panama anytime soon. So I think there's no question that people understand that a lot of this is just bluster. It's the way Trump operates, and he does it at the domestic level as well as the foreign policy level. But the point I would make to you, Freddie, is I do think words matter. And I think if you look at all the different things that he's been saying to different audiences, it's not clear that this is very helpful. And we don't want to get into the Ukraine case in great detail at this point in time. But if you look at Ukraine, he said a number of things to the Russians that are quite offensive and are not going to engender trust in him among Russian elites, especially Putin. And I think moving forward, if anything, he wants to do everything he can to create a situation where Trump is trusted by Putin. But if you look at what he says and how he says it, I don't think he's, helping his cause. Trump is helping his cause. So words do matter, even for realists. And I think in that regard, he's not been terribly smart.